This is kind of where we've been leading, what we need before we can move any further, before we can start implementing controls. We have to get risk management. And it is the foundation for all security decisions that we make. And really, so many decisions we make throughout life really ought to be based on risk management. So when we do talk about risk management, let's define it in context of information security risk management, because you'll hear ISRM. You might hear enterprise risk management. That just speaks to the fact that the entire organization should have the same risk framework and the same risk approach. So ultimately, what are we doing? We're managing risks associated with the use of technology, specifically, of course, information technology. All right, well, what do? Well, we have to identify, assess, respond to risks that specifically are directed at the CIA triad with information, right? So what is this idea of identify, assess, risk treatment, or response? Well, that's what we're going to look at across the next couple of slides. But before we can really get into those processes, let's make sure we're using the same lingo, because one of the things I find is every organization kind of has their own lexicon, and one organization may use mitigation one way, another may use mitigation a different way. Sometimes people will use threats and vulnerabilities and risks, all three of those interchangeably. And particularly for an exam like this, you really have to be solid on your definitions. It's very worthwhile in just spending some time memorizing terms, okay? Assets. You got to start off with the assets, because the first step in risk management is figuring out what you're protecting and what it's worth. So it's whatever I value. Now remember, when you're determining the value of assets, not all assets are easy to put a dollar amount on. I can give you a dollar amount for a laptop, but chances are really good the real value for the laptop comes from the data that's on it. It might be information that I would be subjected to a fine if it got compromised. Or, I might have intellectual property on there. Or it might be really embarrassing for me as a security professional to have my laptop stolen. So just in that, perspective, my laptop is suddenly a lot more valuable than the $50 I could get selling it on Craigslist. So many elements add to the value of the asset. All right, we figured out what we're protecting, what's it worth. The next piece is, what are the vulnerabilities? Are there weaknesses in this asset? Are there areas that are not protected? Are there vulnerabilities? So the vulnerabilities are the weakness. I've heard people say vulnerabilities are the absence of a safeguard. Okay. But you can have. Well, I don't want to split hairs with that, because I've seen that definition in relation. Sorry about that. I've seen that definition in relation to this exam, so I don't want to muddy the waters. I don't think that's the best definition, but there it is. All right. So vulnerability is a weakness. Threat is going to pose harm to the asset. The threat agent carries out the attack, and when that happens is an exploit. Now we're going to put controls in place to mitigate or reduce or lessen the risk. But the risk is the likelihood that that event will happen. So to put this in context, my data is my asset. Right? The vulnerabilities, I have weak passwords protecting my data. The threat is someone could compromise the passwords and access my data. And the threat agent would be the attacker that does it, and the software that they use to compromise, like Loftcrack or some other password crack. Okay. The exploits when it happens. The risk is, if I do nothing, what is the probability and impact that that'll happen? So what's the likelihood that if I don't strengthen my passwords, what's the likelihood that I will have a compromise or an exploit? That's the value of risk. So tie risk in with likelihood. Okay. Now, it's very high likelihood. It's a greater risk than I'm willing to take on. So what do? I implement controls. I implement a password policy that requires users to have strong passwords, or I implement multi-factor authentication. Those are controls that we put into place. So controls are there to safeguard or to protect our assets. Now, there are two terms, safeguards and countermeasures. I've heard them, again, I've heard some of these used interchangeably. Really, a safeguard's proactive, a countermeasure's reactive. So a safeguard maybe prevents or deters. Firewall is a safeguard. A countermeasure is reactive. So reviewing an audit log, that's reactive. That's a countermeasure. To be honest with you, not everything you read will use those terms as such. So I can't give you a 100% guarantee that CISSP books that you read will really specify that. They may not differentiate, but that's the real difference between the terms. Safeguards are proactive, countermeasures are reactive. All right, total risk. Total risk, there is just a certain amount of risk that exists with everything, right? Total risk can be considered to be inherent risk. So it's the risk that's there, the risk that's just there, right? Before you implement countermeasures. There's just a certain amount of risk with getting out of bed in the morning, particularly if you're 47 years old or older. And I know some of you are sitting there shaking your heads with me, absolutely, right? You young whippersnappers, old age is coming for you too. So you just get off my lawn. As the hours get later, I'll get a little punchier. I do want to go on record as saying I'm only drinking Diet Coke, nothing in the mixture. All right, so safeguards and countermeasures. Total risk. What's the amount of risk that exists before implementing countermeasures, right? Well, countermeasures are safeguards. The idea is those countermeasures and safeguards are going to bring down the amount of risk. What I want to do is bring that risk amount down to a level that's acceptable to senior management. And I do that through implementing controls. Most of the time, though, I can't bring risk down to zero, right? You can't eliminate risk. Some risks I can avoid, I just won't do it, right? I don't want to, I'm looking at opening an office in an area of political unrest. It's too risky, I just don't do it. I've avoided the risk. But we really don't talk about eliminating risks, right? You just can't. You just don't totally eliminate risk. Most of the time, we treat a risk, bring down its likelihood, we treat it some more, we do some more, we do some more, until finally there's just that certain amount of risk you can't get rid of. No matter what you do, there's always going to be a little bit of risk left over, and that's residual risk. It's the risk that's left over after applying treatment. And our goal, really, the whole purpose of risk management is to reduce residual risk to the degree that's acceptable. So risk management is about bringing residual risk down to a point we can tolerate. All right, and then the last term, secondary risk. A secondary risk is when one risk response triggers another risk event. Darned if you do, darned if you don't. All right, I fix one problem just to cause another. Security patches or service packs or updates. You know, you've got a system, you hear there's a vulnerability, so you rush out and download a patch to shore up that vulnerability, and the next thing you know, your system's in continual reboot, right? Well, I fixed the security problem because now I've rendered my system inaccessible. Many times, if we don't follow the process through, and we just think very short term, we fix one problem, but by not following that through, we wind up leaving ourselves vulnerable to another instance. The nature of a risk is that it's unknown. Once a risk materializes, it's no longer a risk, it's known. So then it becomes an incident. So a risk that's transpired or materialized is an incident.